All right, I'm recording.
Thanks, Kyle. We are gathering for our November Segal convening to have a little Segal election reflection. And given that the screen share is what's allowing us to see David and the DC crew, I won't share a screen. I had a little bit of highlights about our three fellows that are going to talk to us briefly. And then I hope everyone will dive in, because this month, this year, this couple years, this decade, campaigns and elections are something that have a huge impact in our country, in the world, and a lot of us as citizen leaders are involved in them. So first, we're just going to hear briefly from each of Stephen Larbi, David Duhalde, and Jessie Zimmerer, 3 or 4 or 5 minutes each about the roles that they've played in current or past elections. And then we'll do some Q&A with the group. I know that there's others on the convening who have had their own experiences in the political and electoral world, and I hope they'll share them. We referenced Jess's connections to new politics before, and it's really just a chance to think. It's hard to believe it was earlier this month that we were going through the midterm elections, but we were. And so with that election note, Stephen, I was hoping we could start with you. I know we did a little bit of clapping and celebrating that you were elected this month to the Pawtucket Rhode Island School Committee. Cheers again, very exciting. But it'd be great for you to share a little more about who you are, what's drawn you to elected politics, and what made you decide to become and how you became a new school committee member.
So yeah, Stephen here. I never saw myself running for politics or ever stepping up in the way that I have for my community. But I guess growing up in Pawtucket and living in the same city that I grew up in, I just always felt inclined to give back. And, as I started my professional career, I know my passion was with working with youth and empowering youth and finding ways to provide them opportunities that I never had, that many of my friends didn't have, and give them a fighting chance to compete with anybody regardless of their zip code. And as I started networking more in Rhode Island and starting to make a name for myself as a up and coming leader within the education realm, I did join a organization called New Leaders Council, and to me that was my first opportunity to really dive into politics or learn more about it. And New Leaders Council is a progressive fellowship that trains cohorts of progressives throughout the nation and kind of trains them on various different skill sets to just make them a stronger advocate in whatever field that they may be in. But they do have a heavy focus on politics and policy. So that really opened my eyes, and it allowed me to network with a lot of local politicians, and a lot of my fellows who was also part of the program was heavily involved in different campaigns, including like the mayor of Providence. There was a fellow right now that's the mayor of Central Falls as well. And so seeing some of the early success from other candidates and then being around other politicians, that whole stigma of what a politician is started to wear off for me, in a sense of these people are just normal people. They're nobody special. Some of them are less educated than me. I think I started to realize that I was also capable of running for office and stepping up in that light. But even with that said, I knew that there was going to be some opportunities in Pawtucket, that there was a decent amount of shifting around in terms of people running for different seats. And so I was trying to recruit others to run for school committee, people that I felt that could truly represent our kids in Pawtucket. And as nobody was biting and nobody was really trying to step up, somebody else just really put the bug in my ear and was like, why not you? And since then, it's been a crazy ride. I decided to officially run in May, and just kind of hustled and luckily got through. I definitely had some bumps along the road, with my only experience being door knocking one other time for another candidate last year. A lot of this was new. Luckily, I received a lot of help from other local politicians, but it just really took a lot of me stepping out of my comfort zone. I'm a very quiet person, as many of you know, and so to go door knocking and to like really try to like sell myself to people felt very weird. To ask people for money felt extremely weird, and I didn't want to do any of that. But I knew at the end of the day that this was part of the game I had to play in order to really make a difference in this type of way. So I received a lot of help, including Jessie even coming down from Boston. And although she only spent a few hours with me, that did mean a lot to me, because she like had attitude and enthusiasm towards like door knocking and just like just get yourself, pretty much. She kept saying to me, it actually stuck with me throughout the rest of my campaign, and it was something that kind of stuck in my head, like, yo, just get over yourself and remember who you're doing this for. So stop being so shy about everything. Yeah.
That's great. And you and Jessie also involved some other fellows in the campaign, right? Did LaShawn help? And
yeah, LaShawn helped as well, and that was our first time door knocking too. So it was great to see the Segal network coming together, but then also challenging one another as well.
That's great. Thanks so much for sharing, Stephen. Any immediate questions for Stephen before we hear from our other speakers today?
Can you just share what that organization was again?
New Leaders Council.
Oh, I see. Okay, great.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's usually in every major city there should be a chapter, but I believe there's 40 chapters throughout the country.
Yeah, I was actually a trainer for them in California, so it was nice to see that. But I was curious if you can chat maybe later about like the financial side, because that's what I'm kind of curious about, and I know that both you and Jessie and David have some experience with that too.
Yeah, definitely.
So we'll come back to that as one of our group questions. Thanks for the question, Jess. And Stephen, thanks for sharing that. Jessie, maybe we can go to you next. I know you mentioned your current work with Community Catalyst, and you've been legislative director for a state senator in Massachusetts, worked with a city councilor in Boston, was a field organizer with the Maggie Hassan for Governor campaign. I know you posted about some campaign work you were doing for the Yes on 3 campaign in Massachusetts this year. So you've had a variety of campaign experiences. We're excited to hear about what draws you to this work and what work you've done.
Great. Yeah, so I mean, that was my resume. But I guess I would say my first inkling or my first foray into politics was when I was 23, when I ran for city council in the Grand Oregon. And, you know, I had been a political science major, so, and it just so happened that one of the professors in the political science department was also the mayor for the town. And so in her class, you know, one of the things that we had been required to do was go to city council meetings, which, you know, when I was in her class and we had to do it for class, I found just exceedingly dull and boring. I couldn't sort of track like all of the nitty-gritty details that they were talking about. But you know, after I graduated and became a community, or, you know, was like investing more in the community, I decided to run for a seat myself and served for 2 years on the LeGrand City Council. And that's where I sort of fell in love with politics. It was a lot more fun when you had the binder and all of the information in front of you. And you got to know the backstory about, you know, this particular plot of land or this economic development benefit that was coming down from the state, and like all the possibilities that could be used for it, or the way that you could negotiate, you know, the deals with the police and fire unions or the employee unions. It was a really cool experience, and one that I think, you know, really prepared me for a lot of different things in my life. as Susie mentioned, then, my next sort of dip in was after graduate school. I moved up to New Hampshire for 6 months to work on the governor's race there. And that one was important to me because it was Maggie Hassan was actually the only woman running for governor in the entire country that session. So I thought, well, I'm going to make that lady governor. And so, we were successful, and she became the only Democratic woman governor in the country currently serving, for that cycle. And so that was really cool. And I decided I wanted to stick with politics. And so I came back to Boston. I worked for a city councilor, then I worked for a state senator. Since then, and in the meantime, I guess as well, I volunteered for a number of campaigns, including like the Attorney General's race and a number of city council and state rep and state senate seats. So I am sort of now just sort of a perennial volunteer. I love door knocking. I didn't love it the first few times I did it. I was really, it's awkward walking up to someone's house and trying to get them to care about something you care about. But, once you start doing it and you get to meeting people and you get to hearing about what matters to them and you get to connecting in that way, it's an experience that you wouldn't have in any other, venue and in any other time. So, this time around, during this last election, I volunteered for the Yes on 3 campaign, which was the campaign in Massachusetts to uphold the public accommodations law that protects transgender people in Massachusetts in public spaces. And that was an important campaign for me because I had actually been the legislative director who was in charge of getting that law passed in the first place 2 years ago. So, I wasn't, paid by the campaign. I was just a volunteer, but it was really important to me to keep that law in place, for a lot of reasons. But, one of them being that over the 2 years that I worked on getting that law passed, I got to meet just some incredible families and business owners and people from all walks of life who, really needed these civil rights protections and who felt strongly that they needed to do their part to get that law passed in the first place. So that was sort of what I did this time around. I'm not I want to make sure that we have enough time for questions, so I guess I'll just end there.
Thanks, Jessie. Any immediate questions for Jessie before we come back to group questions?
Actually, this question is kind of a joint question for both Stephen and Jessie. Knowing that you all have different and varied exposure to the same to politics, Stephen probably just started and to be exposed to it for the first time when you ran, and Jessie, you've been doing it for a long time. What would you say to someone who wants to jump into the arena of politics, who might feel there's barriers to entry, or that there's too much time that goes into it, too much money goes into it, there's too much corruption or whatever going on? What would you say to that person if they wanted to get involved in politics in some way?
For me, I think it's just get yourself out there. I think one of the first steps is going out to events that politicians will be at, and networking and talking to different people and trying to get kind of like a landscape of what's going on in the town or city or state that you're interested in. I think once I started talking to people and realizing that I was just as capable as them, it shifted my mindset.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I'd say, there are barriers. So those fears are founded, but when I ran, I was 23 years old. I was easily 40 years younger than anyone else on the city council at the time. I was openly gay. I was a woman. There's a lot of reasons that this town of 13,000 very conservative folks wouldn't have voted for me. But I would say the one thing that really helps anybody who's going to be thinking about running is know what you care about and know why you're running. Because if you can tell an effective story, if you can, if you have something that you can talk to people about and care about, and like they can see how much you care about it, and it sort of encourages them to care about it too, then you're going to fit in any room, right? So like that's gonna get you through those awkward stages at the door where you sort of knocked on someone's door and they come and they're like, what are you doing here? Right? Or that's gonna get you through those times when you just show up at a meeting you've never been to and you have to go around and shake hands. Just sort of know your story, know what your goal is a good start.
Yeah, Jessie, I'm surprised, like in a sad way, like I would have loved to have known you had run. I was wondering what you mentioned that you went to the meetings, but I don't think you said why you ran and how it went. So I'd love to hear about that story, if you're talking about the story.
Sure. So at the time, right out of college, I got a job at the local domestic violence sexual assault crisis center. I was a crisis advocate, and I spent most of my day, working with people to get restraining orders and to get, set up with shelter and public benefits and get their kids moved, to a different school sometimes. I worked with people who were in dire straits, who didn't have the sort of community supports that they needed. And I loved that sort of one-on-one interaction. And I loved being able to do those sort of immediate things for them. But it was also apparent that there were just a number of ways in which systems were failing people. And, as an advocate in a nonprofit, there's not necessarily a way to sort of plug all those holes. It's just sort of like one switch at a time in that role. And it's a good role. It's an important role, but I just really felt like I could do more. And so at the time, I had sort of been interested in government. I had joined the city arts commission, which was like an appointed body that worked on a number of arts initiatives in the city. And so I was familiar with, a lot of the players in city government and familiar with a lot of the sort of processes, then I started going to city council meetings just sort of as part of that. And so, I think that's what pushed me to run. And then it just so happened that a seat opened up, that one of the then youngest member on the council got a job elsewhere. Like I said, this was a very small rural community, so he, I think, got a job elsewhere, and his family picked up and left, so they were going to have this open seat. And one of the things that I did that I think really helped me was the day I read it in the paper, I stopped by City Hall and started getting this is going to date me a little bit, but picked up the DVDs that they had from the city council meetings from that year.
Talk about the latest.
To check out. Yeah, wasn't online. So check them out. You were allowed to check out 2 or 3 at a time. I forget, but I checked them out, and then I just for the next several weeks just went home and watched 2 or 3 city council meetings a night, so that I got all caught up on everything that they'd been talking about over that year. And then
in sports,
yeah, yeah. And then I think the race itself wasn't all that interesting. I filled out my papers. I think I turned it in just like a couple of weeks after it was announced, and I was the first one to turn in my papers. There were a couple of other people that I think were going to throw their hats in, but then decided not to. I like to think it was because I was such a fantastic candidate that they were just too intimidated. But in any case, I got the seat and ended up serving for 2 years in that capacity.
It's awesome.
Yeah. Thanks for that follow-up question, David. And I think you may speak to as well what, when you share about yourself and your experiences, David, what you've seen draws people in to run into this world. And when we open things up later, Jess, I know you may have philosophies that New Politics shares on sort of why people should be drawn into this. But you joked before, Jessie, about being just a volunteer these days. And I know, David, a lot of what you do is with people who are a lot as volunteers and a lot in other ways. So David, you're now the political director at Our Revolution, and you work with Democratic Socialists of America and a number of other roles. So excited to have you share about your experiences related to the electoral world and campaigns.
Sure, thanks. I'll try to keep it brief as well, as I think the Q&A has been more valuable. parts. Not that your opening remarks, everyone wasn't so beautiful. So what's been interesting about me in terms of my political work is that I've been in two very volunteer-driven organizations, which is somewhat unusual in DC. I feel that DC, there's a lot of staff-driven organizations and organizations that either have like one or two large donors and then can run these political programs. Whereas both DSA and Our Revolution, what makes our programs almost unique in even the liberal left world, but certainly I would say if you include the conservatives as well, is that like our endorsements, our national endorsements and our national programs, they have to come from the grassroots groups. So sometimes people will be like, hey, why aren't you endorsing this person? And we're like, well, that's not who the groups wanted. Even if it's somebody like where we're like, we really wish they would too, you know, and like sometimes you're like pulling your hair out, but you have to like trust the process. And I think it was interesting to hear what Jessie was talking. And like one thing I remember with Jessie, related to what Jessie's work is like we backed like question 3 and the other two kind of progressive questions in Massachusetts. And there was a huge issue for us was that people really wanted us to endorse question 3, you know, in the beginning of the year, but we had a state committee that was just working out its kinks, and we had to let them kind of do the process and learn how to, you know, nominate something for the national committee, which in the end, you know, was very frustrating. I wanted us to say like, we'll just endorse this. It's a human rights issue. But in the long term, it was actually more important, especially because it won anyway, was to let Our Revolution group, you know, work it out themselves and not like having us be the big brother intervening. And so a lot of what I do is like trying to keep a lot of people who come from the Bernie Sanders volunteer world. So that's a mixture of some young people, though I think a lot of the young people ended up joining DSA, and other people who are really been politicized for the first time, and who bring very much a different wealth of skills and also naivetes in their own ways. But I think that but they very much keep us honest. So like before you guys came here, I had to like jump on for half an hour for our weekly political volunteer call, where we have a team of researchers of all ages from around the country who help us do candidate research, but also they have questions about like how we run things. Like we just started a political action committee, which we raise money from our members to give to candidates, and they questions, how does that work? How do we have a program now and where we were talking to them about, which I'm very excited about because it was like it was me and a couple other people came up with it. It's to run a campaign next year called Bernie Was Mayor First. And what this comes from is we're asking them to help us do research on upcoming mayoral races. And one thing I did notice too, when I want to speak to like people being new to politics, is that we did some calculations early on and we realized 50% of our nominations, not the people we endorsed, but people we were asked to nominate, were congressional or gubernatorial candidates, which is like not where small grassroots groups want to be living, as we say. Like that's like these races are very expensive, require like tons of coalitions, and like some of these candidates were like didn't have any real support. Well, there were all these great races where people were just kind of ignoring, and so we'd see all these people with like $10,000 or $20,000 running for Congress who are going to get stomped. And it used to be like, why didn't they just run for like Stephen's a great example. Like if $20,000 would have probably gone very far in your, you know, school board election, you know, and just to me, if I see you raise $20,000, it must means you have some social skills. Like, no one just gives you $20,000, but you're not necessarily applying that in the right moment for you. And so what I would keep telling these groups when they would be like, why aren't you backing like this candidate? I would go back to like, well, Bernie was mayor first. And don't forget, like, Bernie was mayor of Burlington. Then he became a congressman. Then he became a senator. And like trying to get them to understand like that these down ballot races matter, and they will actually help you run for later bigger office. And I always tease that Ocasio-Cortez like ruins that narrative, and I'm secretly mad at her for winning, but not really. But it's been good, and so I'm really glad that Our Revolution agreed with me, and we're gonna try to do this. And like one of the key parts of this, and I think the very Segal-esque part is it's less about the candidate, though the candidates were very key that we picked, but it's more like the groups have to find coalitions. So it's like Bernie had the Progressive Coalition in the 80s. In Mississippi, one of the examples we have right now is this guy Chokwe Lumumba. He has Cooperation Jackson, which is like this very comes from this very radical tradition of African American cooperatives. And so these people who don't just like come out of nowhere just because they're charismatic are actually picked by their communities. And so that's what we're really trying to look for. And then the last thing I'll end with is like, one thing we've really struggled with actually in DC for whatever reason is we don't have an Our Revolution group here. And so what I did was kind of I was like, hey, Michelle didn't love it always, but like we would just host phone banks here, you know, Monday to Thursday. Unfortunately, then I had to be here most nights, but the team split up and we brought like all these great people who would come from Virginia, Maryland here to like help candidates. And it was really interesting to see people who are just willing, you know, to help people they'll never meet in states they've probably never been to. And that was really inspiring and was a real sense of that, like, and that's, I think, that actually partly inspired me bringing you all here because I remembered using this conference room. And I hope we kind of maybe do this next month too. I think it'll be easier when we have some more heads up that's on me. But it was really just inspiring to see. And I think a lot of it is like learning. And I think you guys who did service will probably understand this even better than I do. But it's like, working with people, volunteers, especially to like meet them where they're at. And then also like learning from them when don't think that you actually will learn. And I think like I've learned a ton from like the people who come by here or my political volunteers kind of pushing me and challenging me. And it's been like a really interesting experience. It's certainly harder than working for like some big money group where I could just like be answering to like my boss and like running ads, but this is ultimately more rewarding. And I'm really happy to have shared that with you, learning from you guys as well.
Thanks so much, David. I really appreciate that. I imagine people have questions for David too. You guys might have seen Steven's chat. His computer was just restarting, but he'll be right back on. But before we throw it out to other questions, I know Jess Kent had asked for, you were mentioning money, David, and how far it could go in one race versus another. And Jessie, you've seen money in a variety of races, and I'm sure Steven will hop back on in a second. But was your question just sort of what role does money play, or did you want to hone that question a little more?
Yeah, I think often when I'm like doing some tangential related work, like the conversation is either about the candidacy as their person and the community, and then the other kind of question, like David connected to, is like, how do you raise money? Like, what role does your money knowledge play in your credibility and your effectiveness or efficiency for Jessie, like in being in office? And I'm kind of looking for suggestions for me to share with other people because I've never been in the roles that you've been
in. So Jessie, you want to go first? I mean, until Steven comes back, you're the only one who's run for office, to my knowledge. Oh, can you guys?
I think you're on mute, Jessie.
Sorry. I was going to say, like, I'm not sure that I can really help with this question because I didn't really have to raise outside money for my campaign. I used my own money and didn't have to spend a whole lot. I think it was like a couple $100. But I think some of the old understandings of of how important money is changing. Not to say that money isn't important; it's still very, very important. But I think particularly with the power of grassroots movements, and again, a lot of dynamics are sort of shifting. So money is important, but it's not necessarily the be all end all for particularly like local candidates.
Yeah, and I think the only thing I might add to that is I think I 100% agree with how things are changing. I also think like social media has actually been this very problematic equalizer, with fake news being like the huge side of the problem, but that they're two diametrically opposed examples, but very similar in that Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump really equalized their selves with other folks because they could use social media to reach an audience. And Trump especially actually didn't spend that much money even compared to what he probably could have spent if he liquidated some assets, because he was given tons of free airtime by CNN and all those people who probably regret it now. but two, like, because he could just use Twitter, which is free for him, and I think that's been interesting. But I do think, like, ultimately money does show a credibility, and you want to, like, at least have raised some to show that, like, you have a range of people who are willing to invest in you for, like, I hate to look at it that way, but it's like, but if you don't raise anything, it doesn't, it's not very clear, even if it's a small donations. Like, so even Maine's public financing system requires you get like $100 or $155 donations to show that at least people were willing to commit, that you have like some popular support. You're not just like running just because like you want to, and like no one, and you can't, and you have to prove some social base. And I think there's a value in even public financing systems asking people to give a nominal fee just to show that and demonstrate that there's actually popular will for a candidate.
If I could just quickly piggyback also, like going back to what David said earlier about like $20,000 would do a ton in a local race that it wouldn't be able to touch a congressional race. The other thing is that running for the smaller local offices gives you it's not just like more bang for your buck, but it's also, as an elected official, you're able to raise more money for lots of different reasons, both because of your schedule and because of your just sort of ability to attract donors, and so it's like starting in those races like school committee, like city council, like those kind of races really helps because you're building a profile that way.
Well, and this is perfect timing because it looks like Stephen is back online with us. So once he has audio, he can chime in on that too. Hey, Stephen. Thanks for your chat. We saw your note about the computer. People were just talking about that financial piece and wondering whether you'd be able to share a little bit more about sort of what you had to do around fundraising and how that played into your thoughts about running.
Cool. Yeah, sorry about that. My computer is pretty weird. Yeah, the financial piece. So going for school committee, I knew I didn't have to raise too much funds. But I definitely, as someone who is new and running for office, who doesn't have the name recognition as other candidates, I definitely wanted to make sure I had materials out there. I hosted I didn't really kick off my fundraising until I held a fundraising event, which was pretty much like my campaign kickoff. I just had a suggested donation price of $25, and I worried that was even asking for too much, even as a suggested donation. But I had a pretty good turnout, including a few larger donors. I didn't do much in terms of seek out sponsorships. I think I was a little naive in the beginning of my campaign, thinking that school committee was very small, that there wouldn't be too much organizations willing to endorse and donate funds. And so I didn't really start seeking that out until towards the primary in September, and I received a few help. I did an endorsement from the school department, which was extremely helpful as well. But for the most part, what I did to raise funds is I sent out letters to individuals and organizations that I knew, people within my network. I followed up on anyone who expressed interest. I created a school committee page and constantly created different and try to find different pathways for people to also donate, including PayPal, even though I had to pay some fees towards the funds that I received for the service. And I know there's other platforms as well that I may not even charge. So if I run again, I definitely want to explore options that allow me to keep as much funds as possible. But I think for me, it was just the constant grind of just reaching out to people. And when people actually said, oh, how can I support? How can I help you? Especially those who didn't live in my city. Just getting over my own nerves of asking people for money.
Thanks, Stephen. That can be a big one to get over. Well, love to know this election reflection was meant to be hearing from Stephen and Jessie and David, but also hearing from everyone else on the call, either their questions for these fellows, or we did just go through the midterm election. So other questions or thoughts on your mind that you wanted to throw out to the group?
Yeah, David, I was wondering if you could talk a little more about, this is not going to be a word about it, as I said, but like the difference between also like living in DC and trying to organize outside of DC. Something I found living here is people assume I'm very politically active and I'm like maybe more informed than potentially the average person. But like, I actually struggle a lot because with DC, like everything's national and it's hard to understand local, and we don't have our own representatives in Congress. So yeah, I'm just wondering if you could talk a little more about like how you deal with, you know, convincing people that local races do matter, and how you work with local volunteers and relate to DC, and just like more about that.
Sure. I think one issue you bring up, which I personally noticed, I'm not unique, but like it really hit me this election, was like, I think especially when I was a kid, and there still was like regionalism in parties. And so I think Peter King is a good example. Not anyone people particularly know, but he won re-election, but there was a real challenge to him in Long Island. He's a congressman. And when I was a kid, he was like pro-union Republican, like soft on the Irish Republican Army, you know, just his constituencies probably were, and slowly became more and more conservative. And I think maybe he always was that way, but like he eventually had, and that he kind of was a microcosm to me of that, like parties have and then you saw this in the Senate elections, that elections are really national now and parties are really national, and that it's very hard to be a conservative Democrat and win in a very Republican state, even because, and actually the issue is partly that like liberal groups won't support you. So I think look at the Tennessee race where the former governor, I forget his name just off the top of my head because I'm tired, but like what field president, thanks Marianne, you know, what said he would have voted for Kavanaugh. So then all these liberal groups pulled support, and so it was already a tough race to begin with. And I think that you could have seen that on both sides, which is why like the flips actually were like Arizona and Nevada, which are becoming more blue, elected blue senators, and states that were really, really Republican, except for West Virginia, elected Republican senators. And like people couldn't hold on. I don't think you could have put a real liberal there or a conservative Democrat. I don't think it would have made a difference. I think people have a national identity. And so locally, what that means is like you're competing, one, that people like here, and this was something we noticed, which I didn't mention, so I'm glad you did, is like we would, at first what we did was we would just say like, today is, I'm going to name them because you probably won't know them and that's important. Like I'll be like, today's J.D. Schulten, tomorrow is Paulette Jordan, and Wednesday will be Stacey Abrams. And we'd have a packed house for Stacey Abrams, and no one would show up. We'd be having like interns making the calls for these local, which we thought were like very important races, but then we realized, of course, most people aren't paying attention. So what we would do there is we would kind of, one was we started pairing up people. So like it would be Stacey Abrams and candidate you haven't heard of night, and then people would show up and we'd give the candidate you haven't heard of script, unless they said, you'd have to say, I want Stacey Abrams. And so you do that. So that was one thing we would do. The other thing is like, but then the other thing is just like doing more organizing. So one is we actually like, there was a Kansas candidate and we said like, can you give us your DC donors? And we promised we won't fundraise off them. And we just emailed them, or like, and texted them, come volunteer. And like, they did a better thing. But to the local stuff, it's hard. I think one is DC is especially hard. We've been having initial conversations, but people, it's still a machine town. I mean, it's like Muriel Bowser and her team really run the city. It's not, politics is not particularly inspiring. So stuff we've been thinking about is like working with folks on how to run for office. And we're going to try to take this nucleus of people who did come, and we're looking at some like insurgent or clean Democrats, like, and seeing like, who are potentially running and seeing if we can get them excited to support some people. So the answer to your question, which is a little long-winded, but is like, what we did was, because it was very hard to get people excited about DC politics, we wanted a way just to get them to meet each other here, get excited to see things were possible, get to know us, and then we'll follow up with them about starting a group where if we just email blindly people like, do you want to get involved in DC, our revolution? People are like, why would I do that? And I think it is hard because in the end, though, we are competing. And it was interesting, your face. So I want to see if you have any thoughts, because you were kind of like, but it's like, but I think it's hard because races now, there's so few races that people get so excited about, and that's only going to get worse with the presidential. People are going to get totally ignored, and all these races are going to fight for volunteers. And sometimes you can alleviate that with people canvassing for multiple candidates at a time, but it sucks. I mean, it takes a lot of attention away from very winnable races. But Michael, you look like you were thinking about something.
No, I mean, it just seems like it's interesting that I was curious. The candidates you mentioned, known and heard of, those were not DC, right?
No.
Okay. And who are you getting more people interested in DC politics? Are they involved in it, or are they more interested in national?
I think they're more interested in national. But as Callie said, all politics is local, and I think we can get them all. So.
Well, with that question about the local and the national, Jess, I'm not sure if everybody knows about New Politics. Would you mind just giving the 20 or 30-second info for people on what it's about and what you do? Because you guys focus on getting people into the local as well as the national, right?
Yeah, so I started with New Politics as a facilitator for their Answering the Call program, which is essentially an initiative to recruit veterans and public servants, national service program alumni, to think about their service to country in a different way. So the notion is that Congress initially had a steady decline of veterans serving, and thinking about what that looks like in terms of consequences for politics and policy and community. And Emily Cherniak actually had this fantastic idea after working with Alan Kesey and City Year and AmeriCorps of how can we encourage people who have already committed to country to think about their commitment to country in a second way, in a different way. So it's an education initiative through the Answering the Call education program to kind of do a journey, which is very similar to a lot of the leadership development programs that City Year has done. Max Clow, Dr. Max Clow actually created it. And then the National Service Council is intended to recruit people who are alumni. There's also a Veterans Council. And then after they go through the Answering the Call program, there are then a series of other options if they believe that they wish to serve, be it as an elected official, an appointed representative, an engaged citizen, or other ways. And there's various avenues for people to take, both to connect with folks who are running, or to work for folks who are running, etc. So I'm kind of new to the National Service Council side of things and know the education side a little bit better. But it's definitely something that we would love and encourage Segals to do and look into. So check it out, New Politics.
Susie, you're muted.
You're muted, Susie.
Thanks, guys. Sorry. Lip reading practice for everyone. I was just thanking Jess and saying that our January convening earlier this year was with Max on leading with purpose, and he led an hour-long element from this curriculum on sort of what drives you and your purpose. So that's recorded online and on our Segal events page if you want to see more examples of what Jess was talking about. Yeah. Other questions, thoughts, or reflections as we wind down?
I just had one question for Jessie, which is after you were city council, you obviously city council. So what made you decide to make that transition?
Sorry, I can barely hear you.
You might want to hear. I'm going to move it.
My question, which is this: I'm wondering what made you decide to leave city council and kind of, I mean, not entirely change gears, but no longer be an elected official yourself.
Yeah, so like I said, I worked at a crisis center at a nonprofit, and my funding at that job was coming up. It was a 3-year grant, and I was coming to the end of that cycle. I also, was sort of thinking long term. I didn't want to live necessarily in that community my whole life. I wanted to go to grad school. And so it was just sort of life timing, that brought me out to Massachusetts to go to school at Brandeis, more than a decision not to be an elected official anymore. I haven't made a decision not to be an elected official anymore. It's just sort of like, this is what I've been doing over the last couple of years.
Your silence is deafening.
I can't tell if you guys are saying something. It's hard to hear you guys, but
Yeah, are you talking? Yeah.
Yeah.
that didn't come through, Kelly.
Am I the only one that
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry. I asked if you think you'll ever run for office again.
Who, me?
Yeah, you.
Yeah, I mean, I think about it. It sort of depends on a lot of different factors, but it's an option that I, keep open.
Cool.
Stephen, do you think you will continue to run after this, or are you going to actually wait until you take your term of office before you get asked those questions?
Yeah, I see this as like a test run. I don't really have aspirations lifelong, but I do think I have a unique opportunity within my city to really climb, and yeah, I can see myself running again a few more times, but I wouldn't mind taking a step back and being more of a influencer on the outside.
Well, we'll be cheering you on and all the fellows on as you guys choose what your next paths hold. It's really exciting. I see one person had to jump off the call, and I want to honor time. But, you guys know, a lot of you have been a part of the Segal program and the Segal family for a long time, that the legacy we honor is thinking about citizen leadership in all formats and all the hats that we wear. Thinking about elections and campaigns, but also all the other roles that you guys have talked about coming from or going to, whether it's working formally for a campaign, whether it's volunteering, whether it's choosing how you make a difference in another way, but being impacted by that. So Stephen, Jessie, and David, it's really exciting to hear more about your individual paths tonight, and for other people to share more and share questions. I'm happy to stay on a little longer if people have time or more questions, but I do want to acknowledge that we've run over a little bit, and just want to thank everybody for making the time to come together today. And David and Marianne and Callie and Michael and Michelle, you guys are a model for people gathering live for some of our virtual convenings. So we'll have to share a screenshot from tonight and encourage people to do this. And Marianne, do you want to mention our December event, since it's coming right up?
Sure thing. And I will admit to being guilty of not yet having started to read the book of the book club that I'm organizing. So yes, but on next Monday at 7, Phyllis came up to me when we were talking about restarting the book club, and she immediately said that, that this is a book that we have to read, New Power, and I can't remember the longer title now, but I've blasted it out on the Facebook group and via email as well. And there's also a Guardian article that covers the concept in kind of more of a bare bones way. And I know we've done that before as an option for folks who didn't have a chance to read the full book, as still a way to be familiar with the concepts and still engage. And so it'd be super cool to kind of continue kind of a related conversation. And Phyllis will join us for at least part, if not all of the call. And so that's really special whenever we have a founder or other speaker join us. So yeah, hope to see you guys.
Thanks. And can we give a round of applause to Marianne in the meantime for organizing all the
Thank you.
other fellows to moderate.
Yeah, thank you, Susie. Thank you, Kyle.
Thank you. And if I may interject, as you all know, Susie will be going on a maternity leave very soon, by the end of December. So that will leave me the enormous task of carrying on a lot of the communications and outreach for the time she's away, and that includes our January convening. So the topic that Susie has been nice enough to give me a topic that I really have passions for, and one thing that I'd love to share with all the fellows as well is on climate justice and the localized effects of climate change. So if anybody has, experience working or volunteering or being
Johnny Enterline.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Is Johnny Enterline going to be on it?
I am working on it, so yes, everything will be.
I love him.
So basically,
I love all of you, but I really love Johnny Enterline.
I will keep that in mind. It'll go in my notes now. So basically,
and he loves the earth. He loves the earth so much.
Yeah, I'm sure. And so basically that's going to be the theme, and I love to collaborate on that with everybody. So I don't take any more of your time, know that that's what we'll be discussing generally in January, and I'd be happy to go over logistics with a lot of you. So thank you for the space.
Thanks for that reminder, Kyle. And it sounds like maybe January will be scheduled hopefully around Johnny's schedule and Kyle's schedule as well. And as Kyle did mention, hopefully all will go well. I will be having a little one in late December, early January, and then I will be on maternity leave in January, February, and March. So January, Kyle will lead that convening. February, I know, Marianne, you're already thinking about the book group, and Kyle will work with you all to plan something engaging for March. So if you have feedback for him or for us on what we should be thinking about for our March convening, you guys can work with Kyle on that. But it's really special to see everybody gathered virtually and in person to reflect on a topic as important as campaigns and elections. But I also really appreciate having the chance to do some reflecting on the impressive Segal fellow Elsa Vasquez Flores, who we lost earlier this month, and everything that she brought to her community and her family and her friends in the world. And it was nice to be able to do some remembering of her tonight. So Callie, thanks for sharing your stories as well. All right. Cheers to you guys. Thanks for sharing.
Cheers for being awesome, everybody.
It was all nice meeting y'all. Look forward to seeing you all.
Nice meeting you, Kyle.
Thanks.
Have a good night, y'all.
Have a good night, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Great.